All right, now things are going to get interesting. This is where the rubber hits the proverbial road. We're going to now apply everything we've been working on in this thought primer to situations that are a little bit more meaningful and a little bit more trickier. You're going to want to pay really careful attention to the process that I'm going to illustrate for you here for testing arguments for validity using our knowledge of conversion, obversion, and contraposition, okay? So take good notes and make sure you understand this particular lecture. All right, so remember this. An argument is valid when it's impossible for the conclusion to be false when we assume the premises are true, right? So we assume those premises are true, even if we know we're false, and then we ask ourselves, when I assume these premises are true, is there any way the conclusion could be false? And if the answer to that question is no, then we have a valid argument, we have a reliable argument. But if we assume the premises are true, and we can think of just one way the conclusion could be false, then that tells us this is an invalid argument. It's an unreliable one that's not worth any more of our time. Okay, so keep those in mind and look at this argument. Premise is this: some A or B, therefore some B or A. Okay, so now when we look at this argument and we assume this premise is true, some A or B, is there any way it could be false that some B or A, which is the conclusion statement? And the way we answer this question is this way. We ask ourselves, if I applied conversion, obversion, and or contraposition, or some combination of those operations, would the conclusion statement be the result? And the answer to that question is yes, right? If I apply conversion to the statement some A or B, I'll get the statement some B or A. So I know that this argument is working on conversion. If I convert the premise statement, I will get the conclusion statement. So then the next question for me is, all right, is the premise statement the kind of statement that when converted results in a statement that will have the same truth value? Or does it have an undetermined truth value? And the answer to that question is, when I convert the type of statement this premise is, an I statement, I get another I statement that has the exact same truth value as the statement I applied conversion to. So if I assume some A or B is true, then some B or A has to also be true. There's no way it could be false, because when we convert this premise statement, it results in a statement that has the same truth value as the premise, okay? And that tells us this argument is valid, and it's valid by conversion. That phrase, by conversion, again, that's my proof that this argument is valid. All right, so now let's look at something a little more interesting. You'll see 6 steps on your screen here. They are super important for you to remember, so I would probably pause the video and write each one of these steps down. It will make your life so much easier. All right, so let's look at an argument here. Every non-college student is a non-CR student because any CR student is a college student. Interesting. Okay, so the first thing we have to do, we've got to identify the conclusion and the premise. And in this case, we kind of lucked out because we've got this glaring premise indicator because in this argument. And that tells us that whatever follows that is going to likely be a premise. And it also tells us that whatever preceded it is likely to be a conclusion. So we've now identified our premise statement and our conclusion statement. And what we have to do now is translate both of those statements into standard form categorical statements, okay? And both of these look to me like A claims because whenever I see every or any, that's telling me we're talking about all. So we're going to translate this as all CR students are college students, all non-college students are non-CR students. All right. So now what we have to do, and this is a super important step, and I know that this requires a little bit more labor on your part, but just trust me, it is so worthwhile to take the time to symbolize your arguments using individual letters. It's going to make it so much easier and make your work so much more reliable when you're trying to identify if conversion, obversion, or contraposition, or when it really gets complicated, some combination of those operations is at work in an argument if you reduce down the amount of visual information you're having to look at. Okay, so when you symbolize it, you're making the arguments much, much, much easier to work, so the extra work is worth it. Now, in this particular argument, we've got 4 terms, and what we really need are 2 terms that we can use with term complements, okay? So we have CR students, we have college students, we have non-college students, and non-CR students. Now, it doesn't matter which terms you choose. You could choose CR students and college students, or you could just as easily choose non-college students and non-CR students. I'm going to suggest to you, for a couple of reasons that I won't go into here, that when you're faced with a situation like this, always choose the term that is the most specific. Okay, so when you think about when you compare CR students with non-CR students, CR students is way more specific, right? Because that's a specific identifiable thing. But a non-CR student, I mean, there's a million bazillion things that are non-CR students. Chapstick is a non-CR student. I'm a non-CR student. My car is a non-CR student. So we always want to choose the terms that are the most specific and then use the term complements of those. All right, so we've got C and S as our terms. When we symbolize this argument, we come up with something like this. All C are S, therefore all non-S are non-C. And you can see that this is much easier to work with here. Because now what we have to do is we have to move on to step 4. We have to identify the differences between the premise and the conclusion statements. Okay, we have to look at those and we have to sort of create a catalog of all of the differences between those two statements. They're both A statements, so they have the same quality. But I noticed that in both statements, the subject and predicate terms, in the conclusion statement, the subject and predicate terms seem to be in different positions than they are in the premise. And both of those terms seem to have been replaced by their term complements, okay? So when I look at this argument, I recognize, okay, there's two things going on here in this argument. The subject and predicate terms in the conclusion have switched positions, and those two terms in subject and predicate terms in the conclusion have been replaced by their term complements. And now what I have to do is ask myself, is there any operation called conversion, obversion, or contraposition that could be applied to that premise statement to generate the conclusion statement? Yes, there is. Contraposition is at work here, okay? So now the question is, all right, has the operation of contraposition been correctly applied to the premise? And when I ask that, I'm really asking her two things. Did I actually perform, or were the two steps of contraposition performed correctly? Okay, and then the last question is, if so, is the kind of statement that contraposition was applied to the kind of statement that results in a new statement that has the exact same truth value? In other words, is the premise statement, all CRS, the kind of statement that contraposition can be used on to generate a new statement that has the same truth value? And the answer, again, is yes, it is. So that tells us this argument is valid. And it's valid by contraposition, okay? So these 6 steps, super important to make sure you've written them down.